Well, welcome everybody to a very crowded room. Mondays at noon. My name is Ken Anderson. I'm the Dean of the Business School. We'll be joined in a couple of minutes by Kevin McQuilkin. We'll talk a little bit about his background and have a good conversation and an opportunity for questions and answers from those of you here in the room, as well as those of you out there in Zoom land. Want to remind you that this event is being recorded. It'll be available on our YouTube channel, Zach Business Events, probably within a couple of days. But we're very, very fortunate to have Kevin here with us today. As many of you know, Kevin is an alum of Gonzaga. He's not the second oldest alum of Gonzaga in the room. I'll beat him to the punch on that. He would probably bring up me before too long. Made his way from Gonzaga to Wall Street. Along the way, got an MBA at Northwestern, has been a university trustee for a number of years. And this year, as he stepped away from Wells Fargo, we were extremely fortunate to talk him into joining us as our first ever executive in residence here in the business school. So please join me in welcoming Kevin McQuilkin.
Thanks, Ken. You are absolutely right. I was going to bring up that the age discrepancy.
Yeah.
Those of you know, Ken was a basketball player when I was here. Very good one.
Oh, thank you.
There were a few other good ones that people know better, but
yeah.
This is amazing. So Ken gave you a little bit of background on me. I'll add a few little pieces to it. Mostly about what I did in banking. After I left GU, I went to Northwestern, got an MBA, you heard that, and went to Wall Street from there. This is 1986 or 7, in there somewhere. Spent 35 years in banking. I want to take a minute and tell you what I think banking is about. Been on the board of trustees for 14 years. Here, seen a lot of change. I started to think about saying, you know, I was in your seat many, many years ago, but technically it wasn't your seat because this building didn't exist. The business school at the time was in the basement of what we know as the ad building, College Hall. That's where the business school existed. So there's been a lot of change, not just to mention this building, but half the university. Boone Avenue was actually a street, believe it or not, in front of the ad building. That was a road. Cars and everything all day long. So a lot of change. You guys are benefiting from it. And hopefully you'll, when you get off and be successful, you'll be part of providing help to others who are going to follow in your seats. Need a new business school building probably at some point, right? Right. Just a little more background. I've got 4 kids, my wife and I, 1 wife. Which candidly is not that common in Wall Street. It's something that we talk about when people think about getting into the business. It's a tough family trade and something that everybody has to think about. 4 children, the oldest and youngest are Zags. Our darling daughter Molly graduated last May. And the middle 2 went elsewhere on the East. So 1 Jesuit, 1 non-Jesuit, but they're all pretty good kids and are all doing very different things. All 4 of them said, Dad, I don't want to do what you have done. We've watched you leave every day at 6 or earlier in the morning and come back for 30 some years, or not come back from traveling, not come back many days until 8 or 9 at night. And that's the nature of some of these businesses that you all can get into. But I would tell you, and I've told countless students, to be successful in today's world, you got to work hours. You work hard, you work long, work aggressive. But it takes, whether you're doing banking or anything else, to really achieve, you've got to be committed. So you got to find out what you're passionate about and go get it. That's ultimately what it takes. But you got to figure out what you're interested in, what you're passionate about. And that doesn't necessarily happen right out of school. So be prepared for a few false starts, and that's okay. That's a good thing, frankly. So I'm an executive in residence. Who knows what that means? Anybody? I don't necessarily. We're going to figure it out. This is something we've been talking about for a few years. I think about it, this program is having three pieces. One is teaching. So I'm teaching a class now, and some of this, yeah, it's hard with these masks on. It's a pain in the ass, just for what it's worth. You guys can tell them what we're figuring it out as we go. I told them the first day of class that when we brought our eldest son home from the hospital, my wife and I set him down a little bassinet thing and said, all right, kid, we have no idea what we're doing. So grow up, figure it out. And that's what I told the students the very first day. We're going to figure it out. So that's one piece. Another piece is working with students in the Career Center around jobs, around how do you think about careers, about how do you interview, stuff that they do now. Over my career, I've probably hired a few hundred undergrads, another few hundred MBAs. So it's just a different perspective than you get in the Career Center. So I'm going to spend a lot of time there. And with any of you, frankly, whether it's in this building or elsewhere. And the third piece, whenever I've come out here for board meetings, Ken has set up sessions where I can go into classes. I saw Matt McPherson a minute ago. He probably bailed when he saw the room crowded. I've talked to a lot of classes. One time I came out and I said to somebody at a board meeting, I said, yeah, I taught 3 classes today. And I said, actually, yeah, it's probably aggressive to say I taught. I talked 3 classes. So part of the drill is to work with the faculty on things like, is there an aspect of the class that you're in that I can be helpful with a different experience set? I talked to Casey McNellis. I don't know if he's on, I can't tell who's on here. Last week, he's got a case, they're doing a case in accounting theory about Sunbeam, which was a disaster of an accounting story a few years ago. And I let him know that when all that was going on at Sunbeam, I was their banker. So I lived that. And I can tell you a lot of things that went on that aren't in the public domain that were interesting to that time period in that class. So there's a few of those things. Dan Stewart has a entrepreneurship class. And part of entrepreneurship is, how do you grow? How do you raise capital to grow? That's what investment bankers do. Investment banking is about, I would describe it as helping clients make their companies more valuable. And there's lots of ways to do it. Sometimes in doing M&A, I would help them sell it. Sometimes we would help them buy something. But ultimately, it comes down to providing advice about what's the best way to make your company more valuable. We would get paid really well for that. To this day, it shocks my wife that people would pay for my advice. But it's a living. So I just remind her that all the time. So the point, I guess, what I want to get across is I'm available to the students, to the faculty, to do, whatever Ken mentioned this last week. Just ask. Send an email, a call, whatever, and we'll figure it out. We're going to figure out how this program works. At Columbia, as an example, they have roughly 20 people doing what I'm doing. All different disciplines, not just finance. We're starting with me, and we'll see what works and what doesn't. That's the plan. So that's the speech. Any questions?
So I'll get you started.
Okay.
So talk about from living in CM to ending up on Wall Street. How did you figure it out? What were some key decisions along the way?
Okay. I lived in CM for 2 years. And then I lived in Cushing for 2 years. I was the RA and then the RD in Cushing. So I didn't have a vast experience around the dorms, but I did live on campus all 4 years. All along, I was intrigued with Wall Street, but I didn't know what it was. I had no idea. You read about it, you see TV, you saw back in the day a movie with, who was in that movie? Robert, Emilio Estevez and those guys, called Wall Street. But I didn't really know what it was. So how did I find out about it? I talked to a lot of people. I had a girlfriend whose brother worked for a bank in New York. So I talked to him. Every time I talked to somebody, I would say, who else should I talk to? So you network. That's what you all can be doing along the way too. And I tried real hard to get a job in New York when I was leaving here, but it was a tough trip. Didn't work. I knew I wanted to go to grad school. There's two ways to get to Wall Street. One is right out of college, and there's 1,000 jobs every year. It's tough though, really tough to get that, because there's a few thousand applicants for every single job, and it's tough to stand out. The other way to do it is to go get an MBA. So that was my plan. I took the GMAT when I was here in school, got into a few places, and all of them said, come back, you're in, but come in 2 years, don't come now. Those programs want MBAs to have real practical work experience. So I did that. I worked here in town for a small bank for a couple of years. It's part of US Bank now. Knowing I was leaving was a great way to get experience because I knew I was going. So I could take risks in my career early on that a lot of people probably wouldn't or shouldn't, frankly. It was a good time to be there. There was a lot of stuff going on in the bank, so it was a great experience, but I knew I was leaving, and that was the key. I went to Chicago at Northwestern, and the beauty of a place like that, if you want, as a bridge to New York, was that the banks all come there. They come to the campuses and recruit really hard. So I did a summer internship at a place called Chemical Bank and got a job there, went to work, and stayed in the business for 35 years. 20 of them was at that firm that merged a few times and became JP Morgan. Then I went to Deutsche Bank for 5 years, had a different kind of job there. Also spent a lot more time on airplanes around the world. I'm really only 45. It's just the miles kind of wear on you.
That's good because that makes me 47.
I know. Exactly. And then I spent the last 10 years at Wells Fargo, and had been thinking about doing something like this for a very long time. And I'm very glad we're here. We're doing it. But that was the progression. It was, to be honest with you, Ken, I was lucky because I had a pretty good idea early on what I wanted to do, but I didn't know what it was. So the trick is you got to explain it and explore it and experience it. Whenever somebody young comes into my office and is banging the table, I'm going to do M&A. That's what I'm going to do. I have a concern because if you don't know what it is, if you haven't done it, you can't be that committed to it. And it also, frankly, suggests a challenge in your judgment because you're making decisions without the full set of available information. So it's okay to say, I think I want to do this. But to be that adamant without having that experience is a challenge. So that's the answer to that question. It was, I was lucky. I didn't have a false start. I wouldn't call a false start at making a decision and finding out you don't like it. That wouldn't be a false start. But I didn't have to do that because I had a pretty good idea what I wanted to do. I was curious. The way I would always answer that question a lot of times in recruiting sessions was when I was in school, and even before I was in school here, reading the Wall Street Journal, which I'm sure you all do every day. What do people look at? They look at different things. The first thing some people look at is what did the stock market do? Some people look at the editorials. Some people look at the little cartoon back in the editorial page. Some people look at who blew up who in some country you can't pronounce. I always looked at the deals. Who's buying what? Who's getting attacked? Who's selling? That's what I always did. So it wasn't intentional. It's just, that's what caught my attention. It gets back to the point about you got to find what you really want to do. And sometimes that's hard.
So you got a whole room of mostly undergraduates, both in the room and on Zoom. You talk about some of the more valuable parts of your Gonzaga experience.
Yep. I actually made a note to myself about that. One of the things that happens here, it's not necessarily in this building, but a lot of the liberal arts core stuff that you all sometimes grudgingly have to do. Whenever I talk to undergrads or just students in general, they say, what classes did you take that are the most valuable in your job? And their expectation is that I say finance or accounting. And I took a lot of those. My answer is philosophy. That's the part that can differentiate you all compared to others. The critical thinking skills that are embedded in the business school, for sure. It's a big part of it. But the other things that are going on can differentiate you. It's critical thinking. It's think about any business situation you're ever going to be in. If you can identify the problem, what's the issue? Come up with a solution, which could be who knows what, but it could be anything. And then most important of all, you have to be able to sell it. You have to be able to articulate what it means, what the value is, in writing and verbally. You could come up with the greatest app in the history of the galaxy, and if you can't sell it, it's not worth anything. And that's what this place does. Most of you don't even realize it yet. I know I didn't realize it for 5 years, maybe more. If you're a senior, you're worried about it. Do I graduate? Do I get a job? And what am I doing Friday night? That's your list. It's happening though. And pay attention to that going on. It's in the water, it's in the air, it's kind of in the building that's seeped in over the years, but it's real. And it does make a difference as you go forward, no matter what you're doing, really. It doesn't even have to be business. It can be anything. But that's, to me, the most important part of this place. And that's why I come back a lot, for just that reason, because it's unique. It's definitely a Jesuit thing. I had a young guy working for me many years ago who, working on a project, sends me an email. He says, here's the situation. What should we do? I said, what do you think we should do? And his response was, I forgot, we do the Jesuit thing with you. But that's the point. The point is you got to think. Right? The first boss I ever had gave me an assignment. I did the analysis. I brought it back to him, set it down. He said, okay, what do you think? And I kind of stuttered. I did what you told me. I didn't know I was supposed to think. The answer is you got to think all the time. Do the analysis. We talked about your project class. Don't just do the work. Tell them what it means. Tell them what you think. Doesn't mean you have to be right, but just demonstrating the initiative to put yourself out there is critical. When I tell young bankers, if you remember, I said our clients pay us for our advice, for our judgment. That's what we get paid for. I can teach anybody with a basic level of horsepower the technical stuff. I can do that. What's really hard is to teach somebody to have the inner conviction, courage, maturity, whatever word you like, to actually step out and have an opinion. There was a young guy that worked for me for a long time. He's now very, very successful private equity guy. He would come into my office with an analysis and say, this is the answer, like religious conviction, what the right answer was. Many times it was just so wrong as to be like science fiction almost. But I could teach them how do you think about the analysis. What does this mean? There's, okay, that's fine, but here's another way to think about it. What it's hard to do is teach somebody to step up and have that commitment and confidence to deliver an idea. That's part of what this place helps you do. So take advantage of standing up in class and talking. Take advantage of asking questions, always. It's just the process is critical. That's what differentiates this place, especially compared to the other schools around the Northwest. There's a Jesuit aspect to it, for sure.
Question from the audience here in 120. Good question for Kevin.
Hi, Kevin. I'm Yun Searle. I'm an assistant professor today. So it's very nice to have someone like you. And I actually have my students to show up here. And I think it's wonderful to have someone like you. So my current teaching or class is intermediate finance, where all the finance majors have to take.
Yep.
So we cover a chapter related to financial institutions and intermediaries, and then we also cover many different aspects, but not M&A yet. But just, I think some students here already are a bit senior in the sense that they are already juniors and seniors. So my question is, could you describe a day-to-day experience as you started working in M&A? So it's like junior side of you.
Yep.
What would be a typical day like? And then maybe as you progress and then from a senior side, and then what would it be? What would be the big difference, and what would it be like?
You want to talk?
Let me jump in on this one real quick. So
I
I've got a couple of stories over the years that have to do with this HR concept called a realistic job preview. That when you all go out and look for a job, you want to know exactly what it is, what the expectations are across all these different dimensions. You don't want to be surprised. You don't want to go and tell everybody in the world you got a job with Wells Fargo, and then a month later, well, gee, I didn't know this, I didn't know that, it's not a great fit. So Kevin has been very, very generous with his time over the years on the New York trek. And I've had the pleasure of sitting in on a couple of the excursions, as CPD calls them. I remember one year he had a young woman who was working for him, and he's very gracious about turning the Q&A over to his team, knowing that all of you sometimes want to hear more from his team, who are closer in age to you, than hearing from him. So I say, well, tell us about your day. And she says, well, I usually get to work about 9 a.m. Immediately, everybody's all fired up. 9 a.m., this is cool. New York City, Manhattan, Wall Street, 9 a.m. Who knew, right? Yeah. Talks a little bit more. Then she says, about 6 o'clock, we call for food to be brought in. So the enthusiasm starts to die down a little bit. And then a couple more stories, and then she says, yeah, and about 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, I call my mom to let her know I'm okay. And now the enthusiasm's really dropping in the room. So I'll usually leave 11 or 12, whatever it might be, but I can't go to sleep right away because I know he's going to email me at 1 or 2 and ask me a question. And by then everybody's going, no. 9 a.m. sounded really great about 15 minutes ago, but 9 a.m., 2 a.m., it's not really working for me. So that was a great realistic job preview, maybe a little bit enhanced or unusual, but it was a great way of conveying to all of you what a day in the life would be for a junior person at Wells Fargo.
It is a real commitment, as I mentioned earlier. I mean, now the flip side is that as an analyst in Wall Street, you are getting exposed to issues and situations and decisions that companies are making at a very, very high level, including the board of the company, the board of directors. Should I sell the company? And if so, to whom, at what price, all those kind of things. Those are the kind of issues that bankers deal with. The analyst isn't in the boardroom helping make those decisions, but the analyst, to get to your specific question, is doing the work, the analysis, the spreadsheets, the modeling, putting together presentation books, and really learning and being exposed to issues that just don't happen at 22, 23, 24 years old in corporate America. It's just a different experience set. Now, do most young bankers stay there? No, most leave. The analyst is kind of a 2 to 3 year gig if you're good at it and you like it. It took a long time for Wall Street to figure out that we shouldn't just kick everybody out. If they really like it and they're good at it, why make them go to grad school and come back and do it for somebody else? Keep them. You've trained them. The investment in training is massive, which is in part why we spend a lot of time recruiting people talking about, do you know what you're getting into? That's what you just alluded to. It's exactly the issue. Because the last thing I want to do is spend 6 months investing in some young person, and then they wake up and say, holy crap, I didn't know what this was going to be like, so I'm out of here. That's the worst thing that can happen to me, let alone you. But I'm more focused on me at that point. As an investment, it's just not a good business. So the young bankers are doing modeling, presentations, financial analysis. Those are the day-to-day things. There's a lot of scheduling. If we're, for example, if we're selling a company, we need to talk to potential buyers. So there's a lot of processing that goes on. But even in that, you're talking to different people around the world. You get pretty good at learning time zones. And that creates some funky time zones for conversations. I worked on a project many years ago where we had a South African, US, 3 different time zones in the US, Canadian, and Australian. And we had to have calls every day. There's only a couple little narrow windows where that works, but it makes for some awkward conversations sometimes, and just on your body clock, you just got to learn how to function. We learned, in fact, that Adelaide, Australia is on a half hour, which was just messed up, but caused all kinds of problems. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. So that was a bit of a junior side. What about as you become more successful and then become more mature, your tenure is longer than what are some changes?
Okay. I know successful in tenure, but I don't know about more mature, but that's a whole different question. At some point you transition to having to manage the process. So while the analyst is putting the books together and the analysis, a more senior person is going to be supervising it and say, here's another way to think about it. This is the analysis we ought to be doing, and helping to frame the conclusions that'll come from the analysis. Essentially, what advice are we going to give the client? At some point, my job became managing the clients and winning business. The trick to winning business as an advisor is convince I told this to a young guy who he wasn't going to make it in the business, and it was because he wasn't a good salesperson when you sort through it all. The issue he had was he was really, really good by the end of a project, and clients trusted him because he had good judgment, good thoughts, and he could ultimately he got pretty good at presenting those. What he couldn't do is convince the client to trust him before he proved it, right? I've got to get hired as an advisor before they can see what I've done. Now, some of that is because I work for this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy. Tomorrow, in our M&A class, we've asked the guys, and you're all doing it, right? Everybody's reading about the Serco. 20 years ago, I was involved with a client. We did a hostile takeover of his company. It was not friendly until the end when the price got high enough. And I've asked the class to go back and read the SEC documents of that time, and we're going to talk through how the process went, the tactics, and all kinds of things like that. This is the first time I ever met this guy. He wasn't our client. We were working for somebody else to buy his company. And he's coming to talk to the class tomorrow night. He's now, hopefully, he's like 78 years old, I think. It's one more day, Frank, one more day. That's a little harsh. But after that exercise, he went on to run another company, and I became his banker for 15 years. Because I think the way he watched how we worked with our client in his process, helped him see the way we thought and the way we could deliver, and he could trust us. That's hard to do until you can do it, but that's the senior banker's job, is to sell and make and get hired by the clients to deliver. The job requires a lot of travel. COVID was crazy relief from that. It's amazing how much extra time there is in a day when you're not getting on airplanes and commuting and all that other stuff. So you just become the advisor, not so much the analysis, but I need to teach all the way through how to do the models. What I've told the kids, I can't do Excel like you guys can, but I can kick your ass in Lotus 1, 2, 3. Now, most of you have no idea what that is, but it was a predecessor to Excel. I can still do it. Can't do Excel, saved my life, because I've always had people to do it. But you got to know what you're looking at. That's the trick. The senior bankers have to be able to filter a lot of information down to what's the important piece. That actually is a part of, I think, what I learned in philosophy classes there, is how do you filter through all this noise to say, here's the real issue. That's an important skill no matter what you're doing. And again, I think that's something you learn here broadly, not necessarily in an accounting class.
Other questions from in here or from the Zoom audience, you can put them in the chat. Yeah.
What is the biggest goal that you have for being our executive officer?
Speaking of filtering and
Yeah, no, to some degree, it goes back to, we're going to figure that out. And as I told the M&A class that I'm teaching, what do you guys want? So it's a combination of the administration, the students, and the faculty. My experience is in banking, but along the way, M&A is all about strategy. So there's a strategy dynamic around here. You work with big organizations. I've spent a lot of time with really big companies like 3M, like Boeing, trying to understand their corporate bureaucracy and how the people all fit together is crazy. But that fits in other kinds of classes around here, like the management courses. The finance classes, there's an obvious fit. But there's a lot of places where I think I can provide some real world relevance or experience. And which one's the most important? I don't know. But I know every time I've come out here for board meetings, I talk to classes, Matt McPherson's classes or Danielle's. We did the ethics class a few times, right? Wells Fargo's had a few challenges there, in case you hadn't seen that. But all those classes, there's some relevance to what we've done, and to the extent I can provide experience there or different perspectives sometimes. Sometimes it's just looking at something, an issue from a different angle. Worked in lots of different industries over the years. I didn't do much technology. Very little, actually. But other than that, I did a lot of different industries and can provide some perspective, I think. So that's really what it comes down to, and we're going to figure it out. It's the right question, though.
You mentioned you took some risks at the bank that you worked at before you went off to get your MBA.
Mm-hmm.
Curious what you can think of any examples, of those risks specifically.
It was things like being a little more proactive, and this bank was going through some financial issues at the time. This is 1984. And instead of, like, most of the employees were just curious and sitting back, I could blame it on I haven't been around long enough to know better. I would go into the head guy's office and ask, what the hell's going on? There was a chance he was going to get really annoyed. But it was things like that. Just, I volunteered for a couple projects that had some real hair on them. No reason not to. That was a view I had.
And remember, part of the context for the risk assessment is you're not yet 25.
Correct. I was 23, 24 years old. And, it'd say take career risk. It wasn't like death, right? If I got fired, big deal. One, I'm leaving for anyway. And two is the only thing I had to pay for is student loans, which I'm sure you are all familiar with.
So, sorry for asking too many questions, but one is related to modeling. So, when you said modeling, what are the preps? What are students need to do? Or are there recommendations that you have for the students as they try to be a better modeler? But it's like financial modeling. And then I know that some other people want to ask more questions. So the next question I have was related to mergers and acquisitions will require lots of dealing with lawyers. So would you have to be really familiar with the law so that once you try working for an investment bank, then do you have to be a bit ready to make sure that what you're dealing with lawyers would be something that you already have under your belt?
Okay. Fair question. The first one on the modeling, it's financial models. So you've got to understand accounting. You don't have to have the depth of, cost accounting, for example. That really doesn't come into play so much. It helps to be very familiar with the concepts, because part of the exercise in working with a company, whether you're raising money or selling them or looking to buy it, you got to understand their financials and look for the issues. So you got to understand how cost accounting works at a high level. It's not in the weeds. But to do the modeling, you got to understand enough of that to be able to at least ask the right questions. You may not have to have the answers, but you got to ask the right questions. And it goes without saying, you got to understand the mechanics of Excel and all that stuff. But it's not a lot more complicated than that. A lot of it comes down to experience. Our business we call it an apprenticeship business. You don't learn it in school. You don't learn it reading books. You learn it by doing it. So what I would always tell the young bankers is, when we go to a meeting, your job is not to say anything in that meeting unless I ask you a very direct question. Otherwise, you're supposed to sit there and learn. Now, sitting there and learn doesn't mean just sit there and stare off into space. It means sit there and watch the flow of the dialogue. And when I'm talking, you should be sitting there thinking about, if I were talking, what would I say instead of what that knucklehead's saying? Meaning me. And then after the meetings, we go back to the office at some point in the next few days. And the discussion is, why did we do what we did? Why do we think the client did what they did? What should we have done differently? And you need to be prepared for that. That's how you learn. I would have thought about going this direction. You went that way. Why? So you got to be an active learner in those kind of sessions. That's what we're going to do for the head in our class tomorrow night, guys, is why did they do what they did? Because it's not an obvious answer, but there were reasons at the time that they went down a certain path. And that's what we're going to talk to Frank about tomorrow night. We're going to ask him. That answers the question, I think.
Yeah, the first question.
What was the second one? I lost.
One related to dealing with lawyers and.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, there is certainly in M&A, there's a huge legal aspect to it. That's one of the things we've covered in this class, is some of the laws that govern process. Do you need to be a lawyer? No. In fact, I've told lots of people over the years that say, I'm thinking about doing an MBA, a JD MBA kind of thing, and I want to be a mergers banker. My answer is, decide what you want to do. If you want to be a lawyer, go be a lawyer first. You don't need a law degree to be a successful M&A bank. Do you need to have an appreciation for what goes into the thinking? Yes. Do you need to understand the basic rules? Yes. But that happens over time. You do enough deals, and I remember the very first contract I was given. I think I was still an intern in grad school. And I got the contract, and the junior guy said, tell me what you think, go read it, come back. I'd never seen it before. Gave it back, I said, yeah, it looks okay to me. By the time the transaction got done, there was hardly any words that were left from that original draft. But I had no idea. And there's no expectation that you do. But over time, you develop thinking about the questions. We talked about termination provisions in our class, right? I asked them to find these things. And most of the answers were, I can't find them. Well, that's because you're looking in the wrong place. But I don't expect you to know where that place is until we talk about it. I'd rather you try first than rather just give you the answer. And that's the way you learn. I tell the junior teams when we're looking at a contract, come back and tell me what you think. And most of the time they pick on a couple things, but don't really hit the key ones. But that's the expectation. They'll learn. But you got to engage for the learning to happen. Just sitting back and listening is not going to get you where you need to get to. That's why in our class we're talking about participation matters a lot. It's a back and forth where everybody learns from it, right? You're not just learning one-on-one. Everybody's here in the discussion and learning from it. That's the idea.
Another question.
In the hiring process, is there something that sticks out besides having like really good work experience or higher schooling?
Doing your homework. When I was in school here, I mean, first of all, Al Gore had not invented the internet yet, so we didn't have computers, PCs. That was later. So I would spend my time in the Career Center going through annual reports by hand to research, to be prepared. With the internet, there is absolutely no excuse for going into an interview and not being very, very fully prepared on the company, the business. I mean, send a note and find out who you're going to interview with, and then you Google them and you figure out what you can. It's impressive when somebody walks into the room and says, hey, you know, I'm curious about your experience with whatever. That shows that you did the work. In today's world, it actually is a negative if you don't do it because it becomes obvious you didn't do it. And at that point, you're wasting my time as the interviewer, right? That the preparation is critical. It's just critical, and it's not hard. It just shows effort, shows interest, right? The other thing I would tell you, just as an aside, I don't know how many 1,000 times a student has said, well, what I want to get out of this job is the following, right? And my response for the most part is, well, that's interesting, but I don't really care. What are you going to do for me? I'm the employer. How are you going to make my company more valuable? So if you want to really be different in a job interview, go in and tell them how you're going to help them. Whatever the business is, the nonprofit, whatever it is, have something that you're going to do for them, not what they're going to do for you. Which is relevant because I want somebody who at least sinks in with, here's the experience you're going to get, and why you're interested in it. That's relevant. But what's really important is, what are you going to do for me? So that's a good way to differentiate yourself in interviews. No, very, very few people think about that and do it. And it gets attention. But do your homework. And homework isn't just like know the company. Homework is, what do the people look like? Not physically, but how do they dress even? Right? I had a guy come in and interview, he was an MBA, and we're bankers, we dress like this. You know, I had a tie on, which don't tend to do much anymore. He was wearing a 3-piece tweed suit with lapels on the vest. It would have been a perfect fit at a magazine or an ad agency. But I'm looking at him and going, what's the deal, dude? The only thing I remembered when he left the room was the suit. I didn't remember anything he said because I couldn't get past it. So think about that. It's a presentation, right? You're selling yourself. You want them focused on you and what you can do and what you say, how you think, not what you're wearing. We did the trek. This is many years ago. And we came out here for a board meeting. We did a debrief session. And one of the things that was noticed, there was 3 of us from New York. We were all wearing basically this with a tie. And the point was, if you want to be aggressive, you wear a bright tie. But other than that, this is it. And it was my wife that pointed out. She said, you guys in New York, when you were here from Spokane, New York, you didn't dress like this. You're not making a fashion statement, but you're selling. And the point about selling is, do your research, fit in, right? People hire people like themselves, largely, or at least that will fit in. So taking fashion risk is just not a good interview strategy. It's a bad idea. But things like that matter. They show you're preparing too. I knew my assistant came to me one day and said, you're seeing this kid tomorrow. I said, okay, I have no idea. She said, he just called and he wanted to know about you. I said, yeah, all right, what'd you tell him? But you can do that. Find out who you're interviewing with. It shows initiative, first of all. And then you're more prepared and it gets across that you care. That will set you apart. But it takes effort. This takes effort.
So other things that'll set this group apart, they're going to have a great degree. Some of them are going to do internships, projects, other types of experiential learning. What sort of things, based off your experience, stand out, or either from the perspective you're talking about now, or from making them better prepared for what happens after Mother's Day?
It always helps to have relevant experience, of course. But the point is about internships in particular, you can turn them into an awful lot of things, right? The reality of interns on Wall Street, especially on the sales and trading floor, where they're sitting in front of screens and their experience is fetching lunch. That's what they do. They don't trade, they sit there and they listen, they don't do anything. But they can tell a really good story about what they learned, what they did, and the responsibility they had. And you can do that with any internship. It comes down to knowing what the buyer, the interviewer, is interested in. And then talk to people, talk to me, talk to the career folks, and figure out, how do you frame it? How do you sell it? It's back to the very beginning of it. How do you articulate the value benefit to the buyer? Buyer being the important. You can turn them into lots of things. It's there's, being a lifeguard, harder to do, but you can do it. Everybody understands that internships are really hard to get, really hard, especially very relevant ones. it's a good idea to think about how do you convince somebody, here's what I took away from that. As a lifeguard, I had to learn to deal with people. I had to sell them on the safety things. I had to convince angry people that they had to get out of the water, whatever it was. You can turn all of these things into really marketable skills. And you got to be thinking outside the box a little bit too. I'm not just a lifeguard. I was managing people. I was working with kids. I was helping the parents manage the kids, all those kind of things. Took training. Okay.
Other questions for Kevin? Gotta have something out there. Probably one question.
Looking at the thing here. If it was on here, I couldn't tell what it meant. Okay, that answers the question. Okay.
What was one of your greatest failures and how did you respond?
Greatest failures. I would say, well, a couple things. One of the, probably the last thing I worked on was we working for a very large US company doing an acquisition, biggest one they've ever done. They should have done it. They had the best bid. It was an auction. They had the best proposal. The seller told us that. The seller wanted to sign this thing on the plan was to sign it a month from now, and they accelerated it because the bids were so good. They wanted to get it locked in. Okay. They wanted to get it done on the weekend. Our client said, we have a board meeting in a month. We can't do it. And we were all the lawyers, the bankers, the guys in the company, the day-to-day deal people. We're all going, oh. Every company in the history of the world can have a special meeting of the board, and they do it all the time to make a decision like this. Every time. Never heard this before, ever. And that was what the CEO is going to do. That was his decision. Now, there's lots of reasons behind it, which we don't agree with, but the failure in that was that we weren't prepared. We were just completely caught off guard that this would happen. So the learning exercise there was think, what else can go wrong in this exercise? The other times I've said professionally that were failures were losing a competition to get hired. Just weren't prepared enough. And that happens. It happens, it shouldn't. But every once in a while, you got to get kicked in the butt to realize that you got to do more. One client we were convinced that we were the only banker they worked with for years. We knew it was our business. So we went through the motions, really. We didn't dig in deep enough on the issue. And we got smoked by somebody that did. So the failure was just not to be prepared, not to do what it took to get the job done. And that's also the lesson. Do what you think you have to do and then take it another step. What am I missing? Because the world is really, really competitive. Very competitive. Whether you're looking for a job or you're looking to get into a school or you're working on a job. Recognize that you don't, nothing's a given. Maybe that's the way to think about it. Those are the failures. And they're easy to solve. That's what makes them failures. It's okay to get beat out by somebody, but it's not okay if you didn't do everything you could. Whether you're, the Seahawks or anything else, right? Avoid those penalties, boys.
When would you say is like an appropriate time to take off, I guess, kind of the relevant work experience away from like what you're trying to go into?
Take it off?
Yeah. like work that we've done in our college that's not really applicable to like any career path.
Okay, well, I think if you can make it applicable in some fashion, that's much better than taking it off, okay? One of the, if you can frame something as a, it was competitive to get the job, as an example, right? Human nature is to be risk averse in general in hiring people. People tend to hire people like themselves. They like to hire people who other people have hired, right? Somebody else made this decision. I'm not out there on the horizon or the frontier by myself. They like that somebody else hired you and made a decision. So if you can turn it into something with a little competitive nature and getting hired, that's a good thing. So I don't think there's a time horizon on it. It's a relevance thing for sure. But don't just think about, I sat at the desk in the business school and answered the phone. What else did you do that's relevant to the employer? Right? If somebody's in a business, it's competitive. Every business is competitive. So show them you're a competitor, that you can win. I tell a lot of people, they're asking about grad schools. One of the best early jobs is sales, because it's something where you can actually quantify success, right? You can say, I went to work at XYZ company and I got top ratings every year. Okay, that's interesting, but I don't know who's rating you. So I don't have any context for that. But if you're a salesperson, you can quantify it. I increased the sales in my territory by X%. I achieved my targets. I exceeded my targets. It's very quantifiable. And that makes it easier for somebody to judge how successful you were. Those type of things make a difference. So if you can take a job that maybe even a menial job and turn it into something that demonstrated value added or competitive success, all those you can sell all day long. What's our time frame here, boss?
You're
One?
done.
All right.
So, hey, couple of things before we give Kevin a round of applause. Number one, McQuilkin K at gonzaga.edu.
Yep.
And his office is on the west end of the building inside the graduate school. So, he's not going to be out and around on this end. His office is on that end. As he has said, and I can't emphasize this enough, just ask. Right? You got a question, reach out. You want to have coffee, bump him. You need some advice, shoot him an email.
Yep.
But he's here to make us better collectively and to hopefully make as many of you better as well. So Kevin, thank you for taking the time. We appreciate it.